How's it going, YouTube? We're back today with another video, and today we're going to be refuting the idea that veganism is a modern idea based on a book that I've been reading called Ethical Vegan. Now, when you think vegan, I'm sure a lot of you probably think pink hair, emotional, modern, especially in the UK, in the London animal rights scene. But today we're going to be looking in the past. We're going to be looking at the history of being kind. This is inspired from chapter 2 in Jordi book, Ethical Vegan. I'm not going to pronounce his surname because I'm not actually sure how you even pronounce that. But essentially, people believe that veganism is a modern phenomenon. We're going to start with the idea of do no harm. There's a word for the idea of do no harm. It's called Ahimsa. It comes from the Sanskrit root hims, which means to strike. Himsa means wish to injure or harm. And ahimsa is the opposite of this. It's actually anti-harm, anti-striking. Ahimsa, peace. I'm going to go through some examples of ancient people in the book who actually abided by this idea of ahimsa, which is obviously the root of where veganism comes from and whereabouts in the world it actually started. So as far as we know, the word ahimsa was used in India during about 600 BC in the ancient kingdom of Magadha in northern India, hundreds of years before the Common Era, meaning AD, so from year 0 to now. So this word ahimsa was used in this kingdom around that kind of time, which is interesting because that's 600 BCE and now we're in 2026. So this idea of not harming was around for a lot longer than we originally would have thought. The Paleolithic period, where humans had been living for hundreds of thousands of years, only taking from nature what they needed. However, in the Neolithic period, most people became the patriarchal takers, conquering and mastering the environment, selfishly taking everything they could find and believing themselves to be the pinnacle of creation. This is when the agriculture revolution began, and with it goats, sheep and cattle became domesticated, and the natural empathy towards other creatures must have been set aside because animals now became property, no longer being equal beings trying to survive in a hostile world. And when that happened, for the first time a sentient being had become the owner of another. Now if we relate this to the Bible, obviously that's my faith, this could be seen around the time after the flood, after God's flood, and when Noah made that first animal sacrifice to God. And shortly after that period of time, then agriculture would have become into play a bit more. Now the Bible is obviously a spiritual book. It's got historical elements to it. Although predominantly we're going to be reading from this book today and exploring another perspective, another opinion on history and based on evidence, based on fact, how there were people throughout history who took on this concept of ahimsa in their different shapes and sizes. But it's interesting we mentioned God actually and the Bible because in these early civilizations, hierarchies of beings were established within their societies, so kings, emperors, pharaohs and other superior people grabbing all the power. And this is interesting actually, I'm relating it back to the Bible. God never actually wanted Israel to have a king. They were the ones who demanded it to happen. God wanted them to be single agents, self-govern themselves. But the people, because of their lack of faith, they wanted someone to tell them what to do, which links into what we're reading here now. The first king, obviously being established, was Saul, and that's in the book of 1 Samuel. In the mythology of these early civilizations, when they were facing droughts, floods or plagues, people must have thought that offering the inferior beings they owned, so the animals, to their gods would appease them and stop all of their calamities. And then the senseless killing began. I mean, let's think about it for a minute. Let's think about these ancient civilizations, the religions they had, the different gods they worshipped. When they began exploiting animals and sacrificing them to their gods, there must have been people who actually kept their empathy intact and knew it was wrong. Especially the people of Israel as well, if they even had an understanding of Genesis, understanding of that original world that God made, they must have seen it as a sign, a message from God, being that this isn't the right way to continue. But obviously, history flows through. We get the Old Testament, we get the Israelites, we get the judges, the kings, and obviously we have Jesus Christ, who came at the turn of the century in the Common Era now, known as AD. Now, obviously, when Jesus came, he abolished the sacrificial system, meaning that we no longer have to sacrifice animals for the forgiveness of our sins. But these people who had empathy, who empathized with these creatures, they must have been horrified at the screams they heard because of the animal sacrifice. Even taking the animals to the temple. I know in, Exodus, we get the Leviticus laws. We get the laws of which animal should be sacrificed so that a certain person could be forgiven of their sins. Depending on the sin would then lead to what kind of sacrifice they need to make. And bad news, if you were someone who followed that do not harm philosophy back then, as an Israelite, you sin, you had to sacrifice an animal. That was God's law. And so that must have kept a lot of people on the straight and narrow who really wanted to, keep that empathy for animals intact. That God-given, innate, childlike empathy for these creatures. This brings us on to our next group of people, the Sramanic monks. These were monks who travelled around Magadha, that northern Indian kingdom that we spoke of earlier. They were monks who renounced home, possessions, and the established old Vedic religion, which was a complex animistic nature worship religion, kind of pantheist, with many male gods and a strong ancestor worship component, which included elaborate animal sacrifices of horses, cattle, and sometimes humans, performed to ask for God's favour. Which is interesting, because obviously I'm a Christian. I think of my faith and how it intertwines with what I'm reading here. There were certain tribes in the Old Testament who did this exact thing. They sacrificed human babies. They sacrificed their own people. There's that whole Joshua campaign where you really get an insight into the type of people they were facing. So the Sramanic monks were these people who renounced that old Vedic religion where they would sacrifice animals. And within the kingdom of Magadha, there were Brahmin priests who had a ritual of not eating animal flesh before sacrificing an animal as part of the common Vedic tradition, which shows a certain element of guilt. They didn't want to eat the animal they were sacrificing. So perhaps they felt guilty for consuming that animal, knowing full well what the animal went through to end up as a bit of flesh. Man, this is a hard video. Cool, intellectual one. But it's good. We're taking our time with it. Patience. Here in the book, Jordi talks about this ex-prince called Mahavira. A bit of background to this individual, Mahavira. He was an ex-prince who became a monk, begging for food and who walked naked apparently because he didn't replace the rag he wore when it fell off. Then later becomes enlightened and then he teaches crowds of followers, and in his lectures he talks about Ahimsa, who would have asked the question, why sacrifice these animals at all? He was also a Sramanic monk, so he was not bound to the Vedic religion and he could publicly challenge it. As part of his lectures, he would say things like, every soul can be supreme, and in every living being, he saw the same spirit that he had. He saw the greatness in every ordinary being, and therefore, he proposed that we should avoid hurting any other creature. So in essence, he was teaching the core message of today's veganism 5 centuries before the Common Era. Now, I don't know why all these kind of spiritual individuals, they all seem to come from a place of privilege, a place high up in society. And then they decide to renounce all of that. I'm thinking of even the Buddha. He was a prince and he renounced all of that so that he could walk amongst the people and really embrace that suffering and then teach people how to really get out of that suffering. So obviously going back to that word Ahimsa, the question comes up, where did this ex-prince learn about the word Ahimsa? And, many say that the word had existed for many generations before him, even thousands of years before, because he did not invent any of the philosophies he was teaching. Ultimately, we'll never know, but it's really interesting to see that a prince, an ex-prince, a monk, way back in 600 BC, completely different world from today, was really preaching this message about compassion to animals within the context of his life back in that time. That whole Vedic religion thing, they taught that it should be replaced by one which had Ahimsa as its major tenet. Even if we look in today's world, the ancient religion called Jainism. Actually, in my recent outreach video, I spoke to someone who I believe was from a Jain background, or if not a Jain background, then a Hindu background, and he knew of Jains as he was growing up. And followers of Jainism are called Jains, and their ideas come from 24 Sramana monks, the 24th being Mahavira. That's interesting. So actually the origin of that religion, Jainism, came from these 24 monks, and one of them was this individual who spoke to the people of India and those who were sacrificing animals and told them to not do it, to consider that they have souls, that they actually have a right to life, despite the overarching theme of that day being to sacrifice animals. This is interesting. Maybe we'll do a deeper dive into this guy, because in the northwest London borough of Harrow, there's a temple dedicated to Mahavira, with a typical statue of him sitting with wide shoulders in the lotus position while meditating. We'll touch on a bit more about Jainism, and then we'll move on to the next individuals. We know Jains try to avoid hurting all living beings, but the more senses they believe they have, the more important it is to prevent their suffering. Devout Jains take 5 main vows: Ahimsa, non-violence; Satya, truth; Asteya, not stealing; Brahmacharya, celibacy or chastity; and Aparagaha, non-possessiveness. Please excuse my pronunciations. I'm English. I am not from these countries originally. I'm just doing my best here. Hope you can appreciate that. And that first vow, Ahimsa, essentially means living a vegetarian lifestyle, which avoids harm to all animals, but it allows the consumption of milk. But if you know anything about the dairy industry today, you know that it's essentially complementary of the meat industry, meaning that there is violence, and it's not Ahimsa. But what we can learn from that is that Jainism is the first known example of a cultural ideology using the concept of vegetarianism, which is obviously the root of veganism. So the next individual Jordi talks about in this chapter is the Buddha. Born in Lumbini, right under the Himalayas in present-day Nepal. He renounced his family, as we mentioned, who had given him a sheltered, comfortable life, and then he discovered how much suffering other people endured outside of his palace, and began travelling south in search of enlightenment. When he got to the city Rajgir, which was actually the first capital of the kingdom of Magadha, which he mentioned at the start of the video. Please excuse that pronunciation. I'm English, I'm a Brit. I'm common, if anything else. And there he met a Brahmin teacher with whom he underwent an extreme fast, which involved not eating any animal at all. And then he met vegetarian Jain teachers and learnt about Ahimsa. And then and the story continues that in his early travels, Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, was exposed to many philosophies which used the concept of Ahimsa in different ways. And then he ended up in a place now called Bodh Gaya in northeast India. And there he sat cross-legged by a fig tree. And then after meditation, it's said that he reached enlightenment and became the Buddha, which actually means the enlightened one. And then that is where the religion of Buddhism comes from. And Buddhism is actually rooted in Ahimsa, as we learn here today. Now there's a lot more information I could go into, but since it's just a YouTube video, I don't want to do a massive deep dive. You should purchase this book and really read it yourself if you're curious in learning more. Okay, we'll move on to the next group of people. Before we move there though, we discussed Mahavira, the Buddha, and the Jains, who are all from a Indian origin, or at least around that area. Obviously Buddha's from Nepal. But you could be thinking that the story of veganism started in India, although veganism was coming up in other parts of the world as well. We're still in the 6th century though, when the Celtic Britons became the dominant culture in the British Islands, and in Central America the Olmec civilization began to decline. And then we are still in the time of when the Greek civilization started spreading across the Mediterranean. Now we know about barbarians, we know how they sacrificed animals. They had complex religious systems. I'm sure the Central American culture of Olmec also had this same practice too. But there's one individual who was around in that time called Pythagoras, who did not like the killing that he saw all around him, which all these people who were following these different gods and traditions were doing. Now you may have heard of the Pythagoras theorem. That's what he's most commonly and famously known for. Although not a lot of people know, he was actually one of the first vegetarians in ancient Greece. He actually became the leader of a kind of cult in a Greek city called Croton, which followed many new ideas most Greeks would have considered extreme. Sounds like how most people view vegans today, as extreme. I promise we're not cult members. I'm not going to go into all of the ideas. I'm going to keep it specifically focused on veganism, vegetarianism, treating animals well. They believed in transmigration, so reincarnation in other words, And because of this, they avoided meat and eggs because they did not want to eat anyone who could have been a human before. And his cult group that he was leading, that actually became more and more influential. And the Greeks saw him as a threat, which led him to having to flee from the city of Croton, where he died in exile. But the Pythagoreans, also I suppose the cult that he created, they continued up until the middle of the 5th century. So, you know, there was a few years after where Pythagoras died that people were still embodying his principles and really living it out. These principles which were very similar to that concept of Ahimsa, because he did not want to hurt anyone. They did not want to hurt animals who could have been human beings before because they believed in reincarnation. We'll now touch on some more Greeks who also embodied this idea of Ahimsa. So Epicurus was a Greek philosopher who thought that the world was made of atoms. He rejected supernatural beliefs, so he was an atheist. But he encouraged vegetarianism because he thought eating meat was self-indulgent and unnecessary. He believed that the greatest good was to seek modest, sustainable pleasure through knowledge and limiting desires, advocating for a simple life. Jordi here also touches on Orpheus, who must have been a mythological god of some sort, whose followers were vegetarian. The Greek philosopher Plato even talks about Orphism to describe the peaceful diet of the golden age of an innocent and pure world, whose inhabitants were subsisting entirely on things inanimate and abstaining wholly from animate beings. So they weren't eating sentient beings, they were eating inanimate objects. So a carrot instead of a pig. Slitting the throat of a pig and cutting the stem of a broccoli is not the same. So I'm glad people had common sense back then, because not a lot of people have common sense today. Now we're going to head back into the ancient East, into India. It's very interesting that a lot of these Ahimsa type people were actually from India. So there was an Indian ruler of the 3rd century who became one of the most important leaders in history, advocating for vegetarianism and animal protection. An Indian ruler of all people. His name was Ashoka, and he's often depicted with long hair and a tall jewelled turban. So Jordi obviously goes into more background information of this individual, but we're just going to keep it brief. He had a thirst for power, which actually made him into a violent, ruthless ruler, deserving of the title Chandashoka, which means Ashoka the Fierce. As I'm reading here, it just seems he was very successful in his military endeavours, but then came a point in his career which actually left him questioning violence. This was one of the biggest battles in the Kalinga, which is the eastern coastal region between the Mahandi and the Godavari rivers, where many people were massacred. He had a crisis of conscience and converted to Buddhism, and he realised the goals of his actions did not justify the means, and conquering through violence was wrong. And from then on, instead of Chandashoka, Ashoka the Fierce, he was known as Dhammashoka, Ashoka the Righteous. And since he was the supreme ruler of his empire, he was able to impose his new beliefs on his subjects. And what he did was truly amazing. He created animal hospitals, possibly the first in history, enacted laws to protect species and habitats, including off-season for hunting, banned animal slaughter, forbade feeding animals to other animals, and opposed the use of animals as food. He drastically reduced the killing of animals for cooking in the kitchen. My guy. But then all good things come to an end, and he eventually died and his empire crumbled, and all the animal protection laws vanished. Then eating animals became the norm again, and animal sacrifices resumed. What a shame. He did leave an important legacy though. He made Buddhism an institutionalized religion that would end up spread around the entire East. So now it gets interesting. We actually are going to now look at more people who are closer linked to the idea of veganism. The Jains, Pythagoreans, and all these other people I've mentioned were milk-consuming vegetarians. But there were a group of vegetarians that did not eat eggs or dairy products, what we call dietary vegans today. And here we're going to move into the Middle East, and we're going to look at monotheistic religions. So the Abrahamic religions, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. So around 1 BCE, the Roman Empire conquered the land where the Hebrews lived, and near the empire's second city, Alexandria, which is in today's Egypt, the Roman soldiers found a curious group of people who did not eat any animal products, including milk and eggs. They were ascetic monks and nuns from the two Jewish sects called Essenes and Therapeutae, and they avoided all animal food because they thought it was self-indulgent. The main distinction between the two groups, according to Jordi here, was that the Essenes were anti-intellectual and the Therapeutae focused more on wisdom. But both groups' main argument was that according to the Old Testament, Adam and Eve lived a vegan lifestyle in the Garden of Eden, which they did. If you read scripture, Genesis 1:29-31, it clearly states that God made the world vegan and gave us a plant-based diet to consume. So I guess you could call me a modern-day Essene, depending on how you view me. If you view me as an anti-intellectual, call me an Essene. If you view me as some wise granddad who's got nothing better to do with their life, you can call me a Therapeutite. If we now move to the northern coast of Cyprus, there was a priest of the Greek god Apollo who wrote this about animals in the 1st century CE, Common Era. For the sake of a little flesh, we deprive them of sun, of light, of the duration of life to which they are entitled by birth and being. His name was Plutarch, and he did not eat any meat. He described humans as badly equipped to eat meat, as we don't have any of the claws and fangs meat-eating animals possess. And apparently he was the first person to use science rather than religion to justify vegetarianism, and he became very influential to future vegetarians, which then, a century later, led to the philosopher named Porphyry, who wrote this very vegan message. If, however, someone should nevertheless think it is unjust to destroy brutes, such a one should neither use milk, nor wool, nor sheep, nor honey. For as you injure a man by taking from him his garments, thus also you injure a sheep by shearing it. For the wool which you take from it is its vestment. Milk, likewise, was not produced for you, but for the young of the animal that has it. The bee also collects honey as food for itself, which you, by taking away, administer to your own pleasure. It's just so interesting to see the different wording, but the same principle, the same message within these words, within these people's philosophies. These were ancient people. So the ancient world we can't even imagine. Like, if you look at our modern world now, we've got phones, we've got cameras, mics. You know, we're living in pretty good housing, depending on where you're from. But you have access to supermarkets, water, healthcare, all these things. So to see ancient people who didn't have access to any of those things write about veganism is pretty inspiring, which is why I wanted to make this video. There was another dietary vegan group in the 3rd century CE, which was a new religion that emerged from the Jewish mythology of the Gnostics, which I think actually was started by Simon the Sorcerer, which you can find about in the book of Acts, who actually converted and became a disciple of Jesus Christ. But the Gnostics obviously continued. Manichaeans were very important for a while. They followed their leader Mani, who was born in the capital of Mesopotamia and who was probably very influenced by the Jains. Again, there's a similar theme here. Mani came from a rich family and was educated to be a monk/priest. But he did not like the sect that his family were trying to get him involved in, which was a Jewish Christian sect called El Chazi. So this religion grew, and the elect, the top priests, were definitively vegetarian and very likely vegan. Now, if you fast forward to the 2nd century, there were the Ebionites, who were reminiscent of the Essenes. They were vegetarian Jewish Christians who believed Jesus was vegetarian. In the 3rd century, Manichaeans and Christians were now competing with each other, but they were not yet the dominant religions in Persia, which eventually got rid of them both. I was a Christian today. Reading this is fascinating, but I can definitely get lost in it. I can definitely get lost in just how many different views that people had, the different complex kind of belief systems that these individuals had. But why I'm reading it is because the main thread across all of them was the fact that they embraced a vegetarian or vegan diet and were supportive of the idea of Ahimsa, non-violence. So we're actually going to stop the video here because I don't think I'm even halfway through the chapter and we've already covered a lot of ground. But I may do a part 2 of this video. I do find this book very interesting. I'm still reading through it, this chapter specifically, because it really talks about, historic vegans, vegetarians, individuals who embraced a Ahimsa, non-violent way of life. But there's a lot more to continue on, but this video is probably going to end up being about half an hour long, just because of all the content that we discussed, and I have to stop filming soon. But thank you for watching. If you got to the end of this video, if you did, I'm impressed. Not a lot of people find this kind of information interesting, but I do, and that's why I want to share this content with the internet. I want to put it out on the internet. This video will probably go into my creation care playlist, and obviously I do root the videos I put out in my Christian faith, although that's not to say all my videos are just for Christians. I want everyone to watch my videos. What content creator would not? So yeah, thank you for staying with me in this garden as we discussed these historic vegans and vegetarians. And please, if you have any more knowledge or any more books which dive into the idea, philosophy of veganism, Ahimsa, all throughout human history, please talk about it in the comment section below, because I'd love to learn more about this. So thank you guys. Take care.